Chapter 2. He wasn't sure how long he sat, crying silently in the cockpit, but it was probably at least half an hour. It was late afternoon, and a commercial fishing boat came into the harbor, which caused the gulls to flock in the back of the boat, looking for the bait that the crew would throw over the stern as they docked. The sound of the gulls, wheeled and squawking wildly, caught David's attention, snapped him out of it, and he shook his head again and stood. He removed the 3 boards that dropped in the rear slot of the main cabin door, so that it was not only open at the top, but the rear as well, and swung down into the boat. The smell was still there, although now it was more of mold and mustiness. He stopped and looked at the cabin. She was, in reality, a small boat. 2 steps came down from the cockpit to the cabin floor. Directly in the middle, in front of him, was a table with drop leaves on each side. On each side of the boat, facing the table, was a bench with a cushion, which could also be used as a short bunk. Up front, peeked into the bow, was a double bunk filled with bags of sails, 6 of them. To his right and back, under the cockpit, was a single bed, which Owen called the captain's bunk, and to the left and under the cockpit was a storage area. David wedged the small box he held onto a shelf above it. Under all the bunks, except the forward double one, was bins for storage, no wasted space on a boat, and under the double was a water tank, which David thought held 20 gallons. He couldn't remember how much exactly Owen had told him, and somehow it was very important to remember everything Owen had said. 20 gallons, maybe. They had been sitting at the Fry's Cove on the island of Santa Cruz, and Owen had said how important fresh water was to the old sailing ships. Then they had put on masts on and gone over the side, and Owen had showed him 2 abalone stuck to a rock, and he'd popped them loose with a screwdriver and brought them up and cleaned them and fried them in butter, real butter, and David had never tasted anything so wonderful. Memories. Somehow the good ones cut the worst. The sweeter the memory, the more it hurt. Stupid how that works. He shook his head again, looking to the boat. Down and to the right there was a small sink and an alcohol stove, and on the left a stand with drawers in it and a tiny cutting board on top. And that, he thought, was that. 7 feet wide at the widest and maybe 20 feet long inside if you counted the storage space under the cockpit. On the back of the cockpit, sealed off from the inside of the boat and only reachable from the outside, was a small hatched compartment called a lazarette, which housed the outboard motor, a 5-gallon gas tank, and a battery. Owen hated the motor, sneered and called it a cast-iron mainsail, and David had never seen him use it, not once. Over the front bunk there was a forward hatch, and he stepped past the table and propped it open from the inside. Air immediately began moving through the cabin, and the mustiness seemed to disappear at once. He moved back to the rear and stood so that his head was out the top of the door hatch. The cabin ceiling was only 4 feet, 6 inches high, and looked around at the rest of the boat. Something in him made David want to know all about the frog. Some drive he did not understand, and he suddenly realized that it was the memory of Owen causing it. Owen had been so close to the boat that knowing the frog, knowing all there was of her, was like seeing Owen again, somehow. Owen had cared about how a boat sailed more than about how she looked. That's why the frog had 6 sails, even a spinnaker and a tough little storm trysail, and nowhere on the boat was there a cute little decal with one of those quippy sayings like "the captain's word is law" or "marriages performed on this boat good for duration of the voyage only." The top of the boat, the outside, looked like Owen's as well. She was all business, stretching from the front pulpit to a back stanchion, and all around the frog were stainless steel lifelines rigged in stout stainless steel posts. The mast was laminated spruce, a rectangle, and the boom was also spruce, but attached at a right angle to the mast with a worm gear and crank arrangement, so the boom could be rotated to roll down part of the mainsail in a strong wind, an action called reefing. And a way of reducing the area of the sail. He knew the crank was in the hardware drawer under the sink. In the same drawer was a sewing kit for repairing sails, another crank handle for the winches in the cockpit that tightened the jib, and some hand tools and a couple of wrenches, a pair of pliers and a set of screwdrivers in a plastic package. Everything, Owen once said, needed to sustain life. David thought of the small box on the shelf below. Life, all that Owen had been reduced to is a small container of ashes. Life. He moved forward in the cabin again and took the sail bag labeled Maine and carried it up on top. On deck, he opened the bag and pulled at the stiff Dacron cloth until it bellowed out. It also smelled musty, and he started the fasteners up the track on the mast, heaving down on the halyard, the rope that hoists the mainsail, as he added each fastener to the track. As he pulled them up, he also pulled the bottom edge fasteners out along the boom and put the stiffening boards, the battens, into the little pockets along the trailing edge of the sail, so that when it was all the way to the top of the mast, it was also out on the boom. The evening breeze kicked against the sail, making it slap back and forth. He smiled, thinking of Owen again. The slapping of the sails was called lufting, and Owen said it was one of the few words that sounded just like what it meant. They had been sitting at the dock, joking and drinking cokes, and the comment triggered a whole string of words that sounded like what they meant, until finally David looked up, just as a pelican let go down the side of the mast, and he said poop, which led Owen to mention that the back of the boat was sometimes called the poop deck. He wasn't sure, but it was probably because they used to go to the bathroom over the stern, and the thought set the two of them into making conversations, actually using all those words they could that sounded the way they meant. Ashes, not life now, but ashes. David let loose the ropes and sheets that held the boom to the mainsail, could luffily, easily, and went below for the jib. He clambered up onto the bow and clipped the snaps of the jib sail to the forestay, the cable that runs from the tip of the bowsprit up to the top of the mast, and hooked the top or head of the sail to the jib halyard and pulled it up. The jib was loose, without the benefit of a boom to hold the bottom edge stiff, and it slapped mightily in the wind like a wild white rag. Now the boat was all noise, with wind lufting the sails, and the boom slamming back and forth, and the sails popping, ropes whipping and clacking, and the halyard slapping against the mast. Whap, whap. The sounds, however, somehow made the boat feel urgent, as if she were impatient to go, and David knew then that he was going to take her out. He took a moment and put a life jacket on, buckling it on tightly. He had told his parents he'd be spending the night on the boat in the marina, then sailing out the next day to leave Owen's ashes in the sea. And when he put the sails up, he simply had in mind that he'd air them, then drop them and tie them off till morning. But all that was different now. There was a fair breeze and no clouds in sight, and it seemed to be the perfect night for sailing. He had only a few times sailed out at night with his uncle, but he knew that it was Owen's favorite time to sail, and this was Owen's trip, his last trip.